Well, hello and welcome back to the Not Safe for Sunday School podcast. I'm sitting down today with my boss and friend, Eric.
Yep.
We are in the middle of Pride Month, the month of June, where we celebrate the LGBTQ plus community. Or do we? That's the question,
Right.
because that's kind of been up in the air as far as churches in general, Christians in general
Yeah.
go. And so this is going to be a really tricky
Yeah.
subject because there are many strong views from a lot of different angles about how we should be having this conversation.
Yeah.
And so I want to put it out there as just straightforward. We are two straight cis men
Yes.
who are married to awesome wives.
Yeah.
But we are pastors in the San Francisco Bay Area,
Right.
where a lot of LGBTQ culture
Yeah.
stems from
Yeah.
and spreads out into the rest of the country.
Yes.
And so this is something that
Yeah.
we address very frequently
Yeah.
in our church context, compared to maybe churches in the Midwest
Right.
or something like that.
Right.
And so our job right now on this podcast is not to say
Yes.
this is what is right and this is what is wrong, or even to talk about necessarily what our church stance
Right.
is, what our personal stances are,
Right.
but just to say this is the conversation that's been happening and ask the question, has this really been productive?
Right. Well, and I think it's important to underline what you're saying there, Matt. This isn't us trying to like mansplain this to anyone. We're learning, right? And as we're learning, there are people who are much better experts, that could be talking about this. And at the same time, like there are people who are, steps behind us that are processing this stuff. And so for us who've, maybe been in certain types of spaces and heard a conversation, on one end of the spectrum, and then have leaned into more points of view. I think it's helpful that we didn't just show up and say, "Hey, here's what people say." End of story. It's, "Hey, we've been all over the place with this. We've heard from many different people about this. Here's how we're currently trying to understand." And so, please hear our hearts here that this is us. Trying to contribute if we can, but more just trying to understand and learn how to love people. That's at the heart of it all. Is like that's all that really matters to us.
Really, I think what a lot of this comes down to is like we as pastors, having dealt with this conversation from people of all ends on the spectrum,
Yes.
are tired of fighting.
Yes.
Like it's really become an us versus them
Yes.
sort of mentality. Is that really beneficial?
Exactly.
And so to give some context for the conversation, we won't dive into anything because again, we're not trying to say this is what is correct.
Right.
But there's passages in the book of Leviticus, we see in 1 Timothy, 1 Corinthians, and especially in the book of Romans, where there are passages that address homosexuality, maybe in a way that looks at face value like it says one thing. And there's a couple of considerations, a disclaimer that I say in pretty much every single video that I make about any theology is that we have to remember that the Bible was not written in English.
Yes.
And it was not written in the 21st century. Bible translators, they choose a word or something because it is the best encapsulation that you can get with one word of what is trying to be said without having a footnote that is just as long as the passage itself.
So good. And related to that is this this reality that we have to acknowledge, even if you have the most like conservative viewpoint on what the Bible is, that the let's say you're like hardcore biblical inerrancy is your way of thinking about the Bible. And the doctrine of inerrancy, essentially boiled down, says that the Bible in its original manuscripts is without error in everything that it teaches, whether that be historical data, whether that be like scientific, how creation exists. Even if that's your framework for how you read the Bible, we don't have the original manuscripts. We have translations from, sometimes, from other language than the original manuscripts would have been written in. Even the Gospels themselves, Jesus probably spoke some Greek, but he was primarily speaking Aramaic, and those Gospels are written in Greek. So there was literally the first writers of the Gospels were translating from one language to another. And that's not to diminish the Bible we have. The Bible we have is beautiful. But we have to acknowledge that what we have is not the original manuscripts. And so we have to humbly read it and go to the text. And a translator had to make a decision, and usually a tough decision. And sometimes some translators don't make tough decisions at all. They just put their theology right in there, and I'm going to use this word because it confirms what I already believe, right?
Yeah.
And that has happened with some of even these passages that get brought up in these debates, that along the way, a word that's translated homosexual in an English text, it's not a good translation. And so there are some passages that you can't explain away by that. And so I'm not trying to say that the Bible doesn't speak to it at all, but it definitely speaks about it less than we've been led to believe. Because somebody decided this word means that, and it probably didn't. And so so it's tricky. And we just, like I said, we want to do this humbly because we're trying to be as faithful to the text as we can. And that same text tells us that the only thing that matters is faith expressing itself through love. So we want to be faithful to the text, and we want that text to shape us in a way that we become more loving. And that's tricky. It's just tricky, We're talking about cultural stuff. We're talking about, our own tradition and the baggage that we bring. And so, we try to do it humbly. You don't want to hide and just try to keep everything so vague and ambiguous that you don't just because you don't want somebody to be mad at you. You know what I mean? But deciding whether your organization affirms or does not affirm is not really where the work is. The work is in real people. These we're really good at labeling things, right? And labels only go so far, and labels cannot encapsulate a person either, right? And so for some reason we do this with certain aspects of our humanity, and then others we don't, you know what I mean? And so, and I know we'll get into that a little bit later, but there's just, I think that's really important for us to talk about. As we deal with this, we're not talking about this in theory. We're talking about real conversations we have with people who are wrestling, and we need to see their humanity, not necessarily just their label, and definitely not to see when we talk about this, it gets thrown around this issue. It's not there is a cultural thing or a political discussion or whatever going on that we can label an issue, but what it comes down to is people aren't issues, and people are always more important than issues, right? And so people are made in the image of God. There weren't some that were left out. There weren't some that were mistakes. People are made in the image of God, and therefore they're infinitely valuable, and they're more important than any issue. And I think that's hopefully, when we talk about this, if we can start there, then we don't have to agree on everything, but we can be respectful, and we can see that somebody is not an issue or a label. They are a person made in the image of God. So
if we want to talk about the real LGBTQ issue, I think it's how churches have handled the LGBTQ conversation.
I totally agree.
And I'm going to make a statement, right? You can let me know if I'm fired.
Okay.
Right? But God sees more to you than your sexuality and your gender identity. And I think that's a posture that makes a lot of Christians angry. It's almost like an opt-out of the conversation.
100%.
It's not the most helpful when a personal friend of mine comes to me and says, hey, this is how I identify. Do you believe I'm going to hell? And what cultural Christianity has taught is well, you got to tell them the truth. And the best way to love them is to just not hold back at all and tell them exactly what God thinks of them. And it's and you look at a person and you reflect on what maybe cultural Christianity has taught some Christians to say, or what posture to take. And it's there are so many ways that the church has pushed away the LGBTQ community.
And I have zero problem just saying we absolutely have to condemn that. Like,
Yeah.
like you cannot read the scriptural text and say this should be our conclusion as we hate these people and we condemn them to hell, right? Because one, we don't get to do that. That's not our job. But two, like the text is all about reconciliation and redemption, and so even if you think these things are sinful behaviors, we still don't get to condemn. That's not our job. We are not righteous, and I think that's the big hypocrisy thing that I want to call out is. You mentioned this, like, oh, you got the best way to love them is to tell them the truth about their sin, right? There's that mentality. It's like, yeah, but do you do that with people who struggle with greed? Like, if a greedy person came up to you and said, "Hey, I feel a sense of conviction that I'm greedy. Am I going to hell?" No, because we live in a culture that just accepts greed and almost just like, well, I'm also greedy, so I'm not gonna like. There better be grace for that because I struggle with that. And
it's all about that grind.
I struggle with materialism and I struggle with this and that and that. So like why have we mistreated this group of people and not shunned the greedy or the materialistic or the gossip or the liar? Like why did this become the whipping boy of kind of conservative Christianity? It doesn't make it better. I'm just trying to understand how we got to this point.
Yeah.
And for lack of a better way of phrasing it, I sometimes feel embarrassed, because my Jesus has been used as a weapon against people that I love. And Jesus himself said, you want to wipe the speck of sawdust out of your brother's eye, but meanwhile you got a whole plank of wood in there yourself, right?
Like most of what we've been saying so far is under the assumption that the person listening believes that homosexuality is a sin.
Right.
And that doesn't go for 100% of what we've said, but that has largely
been a theme, yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Because we are talking to those people in particular with a lot of what we've been saying so far. And I've already been thinking about next year's June and ways that maybe I want to circle back to this conversation. But this is really like a toe dip in the pool of this conversation.
Right.
And I've drawn out this crude little diagram as we've been talking here. And I feel like this is really important for us to address in this conversation. And so we have quadrants of people who are inside of the church and outside of the church. They're either Christian or not Christian. And then they either believe that homosexuality is a sin, or they believe that homosexuality is not a sin.
Right.
And so in one corner, we have the people who are outside of the church, and they don't believe that homosexuality is a sin.
Yes.
And if we as Christians are criticizing those people, we have to acknowledge that when it boils down to worldview perspective, they are not playing by the same quote-unquote rules as you are. And if you believe that homosexuality is a sin based on your Christian values, and they are not holding themselves to those Christian values that you hold yourself to, then you have no right to criticize them.
None. Paul even says so. Paul says, like, he's like, what is it my business to judge those outside of the church? My job is to talk to those in the church. And so, like, that's straight biblical. That's not my place. Right? Like, absolutely. I think that's well said. Yeah.
Now, the next quadrant that we have is people who are outside of the church and they believe that homosexuality is a sin. Very similar thing. Like, they get to have their own opinions. And, hey, man, like, maybe stop being a jerk. There's not really a productive conversation to be had there.
Yeah. The only appropriate critique of that is when anyone is using their beliefs or unbelief to oppress others.
Right.
You know, the prophetic tradition of Israel and of the Christian faith is one of, like, if you're mistreating other people, we're going to call you out. Like, you can't do that. We're supposed to speak up for those who are belittled, oppressed, etc.
Now, our third quadrant is the one that we've been talking about the most. People inside of the church, and they do believe that homosexuality is a sin.
Yes.
Now, if you are a straight person who believes that, you really have to be careful of the power that your words hold.
Yes.
And what you just talked about with the potential for oppression, of hatred, especially. Now, if you are someone who's a part of the LGBTQ community who is a Christian, and you believe that your sexual practices are a sin, it's something to navigate in your life.
Sure.
And it's very tricky. At that point, it becomes something that is a personal conviction between you and God, what you're reading in the Bible and the community that is supporting you as you navigate this dichotomy between the things that you are experiencing and the things that you believe.
Right.
And that is a very real struggle for a lot of people. And so I don't have any advice for how to navigate that.
My only advice is for leaders in those spaces. And it's, we participate in that conversation, but you don't drive that conversation, right? Like listen. Be as compassionate as you would be about somebody who had some other area of sin in their life as you perceive it, which is always one of grace and mercy and restoration. And how do we help, right? And I think that is often missing, right? We're talking about somebody who is trying their best to be faithful to what their convictions are. And it's not easy, because that's true for all of us in some way, shape, or form. And so if you're in those spaces, like humility, listening, compassion, that is the posture, and it has to be the posture.
And that actually brings us to our last quadrant, which is people who are inside of the church who do not believe that homosexuality is a sin. You know what? Like, I have no problem if you are coming from a culture that is very conservative and has very aggressive stances on the relationship between the LGBTQ community and the church. I have no problem saying, hey, you know, maybe you would feel more supported at a church that is affirming.
Right.
My job as a pastor, I believe, like I said before, is to convey the fact that God sees more to you than your sexuality.
100%.
And if this is becoming such an issue in your life that your church community is not healthy for you, I have no problem saying, like, here, let me do a quick Google search and find some affirming churches in the area that I think might be a better fit for you. Because it's more important to me that you are supported by a Christian community than diving into the weeds on a, at best, secondary issue in the Bible.
100%. We accept that. And our hope for you is that you find a place where you will thrive. And all that matters to us is that you don't lose Jesus in the process. Like, people really, you know, like that's what it is. Like, the Christian faith is about Jesus, you know, and my hope is that, like, if somebody has to leave one space for another to hold on to Jesus, I think that's great. I've been, you know, in the conservative circles, you get warned all the time, oh, it's just a slippery slope, then what happens next? And yet I see people who, you know, disagree with those conservative spaces, and their faith in Jesus is thriving. And so I think it's important the way you framed that, of like, we humbly say, we get it. If you can't grow in that space, if you can't thrive in your relationship with Jesus in that space, it's okay to find another space.
What it really comes down to is that there are people who are much smarter than me that have not figured it out yet, who are translating the Bible. And so if they're still going on in circles and debating about this, then you know what? Maybe it's not productive for me as a pastor to start to take hard stances on something that
I think it's really
is up in the air.
This, to me, is where a lot of really important work needs to be done in the church, right? The conversation that is being had by both those who don't affirm and those who do affirm, whether they're inside or outside the church. There is an assumption by people on, you know, with certain religious convictions that gender and sexuality are essential identity markers for human beings. And that's true for gender and sexuality. I think that's a mistake. And I think it's a mistake on both sides. It's the same assumption. The same assumption is that gender and sexuality are key identity markers. But the problems with that are rife. You know, we'll often hear from the culture that's maybe outside of the church, maybe more in the affirming camp, that gender is a social construct. And that really makes the religious people mad. And what I'm here to say is, I actually agree. Gender is a social construct. It was essentialized in religious circles. It is immoral for a woman to wear pants. What are we talking about? It's stupid. We have sold this idea to the world for a long time. Western Christianity has made gender and sexual identity core to who human beings are. Here's what I know about Christianity. We follow a celibate person whose gender identity had nothing to do with his ministry, with his value, with any of that. He used his position as a man to uplift those who were shunned by society. Now that's some religion I can get on board with.
Right.
You know what I'm saying? Like, I just don't, like, we've made this the conversation. And so to those who are, you know, in LGBTQ plus community, this whole thing was thrust upon you. Often the way we think about things is in a response to something that we clearly feel is unhealthy. And so this is the conversation that was thrust upon you. Here are the gender and sexual norms that were thrust upon you. So I'm not judging you for how you think, but I would just offer up that it's the responsibility of the Christian to redeem this conversation, to humbly go and listen, to repent. I'm sorry for what's been done or said to you in Jesus' name. It's not from Jesus. It's not. And I'm sorry that you've experienced this. And if we could heal this divide and have a better conversation, we want to participate. And I understand if you don't want to. I think we just have to accept that. So much damage has been done that maybe nobody wants to have a conversation with us for a while, and that's okay. Maybe we haven't earned that right. And I think that's, like, it is our responsibility to do the work to heal what has happened and to heal even the way this conversation goes. So, yeah, thanks for having me. It's been fun, and I hope this is helpful.
Yeah.